Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, we're on the road. You can probably hear that we're recording from inside of a quite loud car on an autobahn. Where are we, Chris?
We are apparently quite close to Greifswald Süd, but I don't think that answers your question. So we flew to Berlin last night, and then this morning at the crack of dawn, we jumped in our hire car, and we are currently heading northwest out of Berlin, and we are 96 kilometers away from a place on the northwest coast of Germany called Peenemunde. Gareth, why don't you share with us a little bit about what Peenemunde is?
Yeah, so this is Battling with Business road trip. Peenemunde is, as you say, on the north coast, on the Baltic coast of North Germany, quite close to the Polish border, and it was the centre of research and experimentation for some of the German Wonder weapons of the Second World War, and was the initial place where they built the V1 Doodlebug and the V2 rocket. It's a place that, firstly, you and I have wanted to visit for a long time.
Yeah, so this is just an excuse
Absolutely.
for us to take a weekend away, and we explained to our wives this was very important that we were doing research for Battling with Business, but is in fact a weekend away.
Yeah, it's quite a geeky holiday, really. But I think it's a really interesting place for many things. So firstly, from a historical perspective, a very important aspect of the Second World War, and we can sort of explore that once we get there and sort of talk about the impact that these weapons did or didn't have, and the operations that were undertaken by the Allies to undermine and defeat them. I think also quite interesting from a philosophical perspective on why the Nazi regime spent so much effort trying to build these things rather than investing that capacity elsewhere in the war effort. And from a leadership and a management perspective, these are large, complex, arguably these are your big, hairy, audacious goals that you've talked about before.
This, I mean, in a sense, this is the German equivalent of the nuclear program.
Well, it actually costs more.
And the Norden bomb site as two big things. One of the things that occurs to me as we go, though, that whenever you visit a Nazi site and you start talking about the kind of stuff we talk about, there is a risk that we start to imply that, well, Nazis are obviously bad. However, let's talk about that is absolutely not our intention. And so one of the things that I want to be sensitive as we go through is they did bad things, but there's some interesting parallels. And as I was driving along this morning as we left early from Berlin, is that there's a really interesting modern day comparison, and we'll take the Nazis out of the picture, as it were, for a while. But if you think about it, Gareth, there is a very modern day comparison for what the Germans were doing in the mid sort of 40s or the early 40s, 1940s onwards. Right now we've got Elon Musk building these rockets. Now, they are clearly not weapons of war, but actually the process of figuring out how to build rockets and then blowing up on launch pads and iterating is a very interesting modern day equivalent. How is what we are doing today and what Elon Musk is doing today very, very different? Almost to your point of the things that we talk about, which are abhorrent in terms of the slave labor, the purpose to kill people. Can you make these technical advances without those things? I think if you spoke to some of the Nazis, they would argue this was the most logical and practical way to do it. That's clearly not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right to bring up the sensitivities around what this site that we're going to actually was, and as you say, it was built on the backs of prisoners of war, mostly Polish prisoners of war, slave labour, and somewhere between 15 and 1600, I think, casualties at the Peenemunde site were prisoners of war, and they should be absolutely included in the casualty figures that this weapons program created. And I think there's an interesting question that we can explore around whether there is a necessity to go about developing and innovating through the methods that the Nazis used. And I don't think there is. And I think we hopefully will find out when we get there that actually we did an episode not that long ago on Oppenheimer based on the movie and explored sort of some of the concepts around how the US and the Allies built the atomic weapons program at Los Alamos and other locations, the Manhattan Project, and hopefully we'll see that actually there are far better ways of managing innovative, complex technical development projects, even in times of war. That one of the things I'm hoping to get out of this is to demonstrate that actually there was a lot of flawed logic and slightly perverse thinking that actually
arguably was counterproductive.
Counterproductive.
And I think there's another area of hubris as well.
Absolutely,
In terms of, I know this is cliche, we are the master race, and therefore, by definition, everything we do is right. So anyway, fascinating. And so if our wives are listening, we just want to make it very clear we're working very hard today, and we definitely didn't have a few beers last night, and we're definitely not looking forward to our German sausage tonight.
Awesome. Right, well, shall we pick this up when we get there?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
So, Gareth, we've stepped out of the car, and frankly, it is a pretty overcast and not very friendly looking day here at Peenemünde. But we've just come into the museum, and the first thing you do, which is really easy to miss, is the entrance to the museum and where you get your entrance tickets is actually the bomb shelter, or at least one of the bomb shelters for many. And so that was interesting to see as we come in, 3-foot walls of concrete. And I suspect most people going through just wouldn't even think about the fact that people would sort of crowd in there. And then, as you talked about sort of when we were in the car, Operation Hydra, there was, I believe it was over 500 aircraft came to bomb the place. Probably pretty terrifying. But we're through the entrance gates now, and in front of us, I guess, is the whole point of this activity. So we are in front of, which I think the correct terminology is, the A4 liquid fuel rocket, which is otherwise known as the V2 rocket. And for those of you who know exactly what I mean, I apologise, we'll go in and talk a bit more about it. But those of you who kind of like V1, V2, whatever this, if you have ever seen Tintin Goes to the Moon, you'll be able to imagine what this rocket looks like. It is 14 metres high. It is a narrow, sort of thin rocket with fins at the bottom, 4 fins at the bottom. It is painted black and white, and it's sort of got squares, which I suspect was all about telemetry, so they could track it.
Yeah, this is definitely a sort of testing model. I think the actual weapons were painted green, and they were colloquially known by the Germans as cucumbers.
Cucumbers, so that would be Gurkha.
Gurkha.
That's my Duolingo shining through
Like
here.
it.
I know it's Gurkha. And this particular one is mounted on a little stand, a little structure with what looks like a cone at the bottom, which effectively allows that when the engine fires, the sort of the energy coming out of the rocket is then dispersed, so you don't sort of destroy the rocket as it lifts off. But what's interesting is, and as we saw this, it was kind of funny to see. So on this particular rocket, and I'm assuming this is original, or at least a reproduction original, there is an image. Gareth, what's the image on the bottom of the rocket?
It's a naked lady sitting on the moon with a picture of the rocket behind it.
Now, do you happen to know the background to this, or is it just the tendency to put naked ladies on things that fly?
Well, there is that tendency, of course, for soldiers to use semi-naked effigies of ladies on fighter bombers and stuff. But also, there is and I don't know the name in German, but there is a very famous science fiction book, which was, I believe, interwar, written by a German author called The Woman in the Moon, which is about a group of astronauts that go to the moon in a rocket and make contact with the woman in the moon and bring her back to Earth. And that, I believe, was sort of as influential on sort of thinking about space travel as perhaps some of H.G. Wells's books were in Britain and the United States. So that's an effigy that sort of relates to the woman in the moon.
But of course, I mean, what amuses me is you could have any kind of woman in the moon. This one is a naked one wearing sort of stockings and high heels.
Well, as you pointed out, we're quite a long way from anywhere, and I imagine it was quite a lonely place.
I can imagine. But quite remarkable. I mean,
Yeah.
we're standing here and it's not particularly busy here, but there are some tourists here. And, you know, there's people just posing next to it with big grins on their faces and pointing at the rocket. It's so easy to sort of get disconnected from what the original meaning and purpose of these things are, for it to be a tourist attraction to come and have a look at it. So we've just stepped over, 10 metres away, and we've just talked about the V2, or the A4 as it was known at the time. And now we're actually looking at the V1, and in many senses the V1 feels more exciting. There's more to it in the sense that there is the V1 itself, which in a sense looks like a really big remote controlled aircraft. Simple wings. There's the engine, which is a pulse jet engine, sits on the back. But the bit that sort of makes it stand out, and the bit that makes it more obvious when the Allies were looking for it, is the ramp that goes with it. So what's the ramp? About 50 metres long? About 50 metres?
Yeah, about that.
And I believe technically it is known as the Walter, I was trying to use a German accent, which is not right, split tube catapult. And this will be difficult to do on a podcast, but I'll try and explain it. So think of a narrow gauge railway where you've got sort of two rails either side, a ramp that sort of increases in height at sort of a 5-degree angle. So it's a big, long ramp. And the challenge was with the V1 was that it was powered by a pulse jet engine, and it obviously had wings to give it lift. But to get it to fly, it had to move forward.
Yeah.
And so the pulse jet engine in itself also needed air to be coming in for it to move. So what they had to do is they had to get this thing to a certain speed before the engine gave it power and the wings gave it lift. And so the way they did this was they created a steam catapult. So if you think of this sort of narrow gauge railway with a rail either side, if you look in between this, there is a small groove, and the small groove is where something would sort of stick up, you would attach the V1 to, and it was actually a steam catapult. So there's a tube underneath this narrow gauge railway line, and when you said go, you would start the engine, so it would sort of start up in its very simple way, not generating much power. But then you would use the steam catapult to force this thing at enormous speed up the ramp, and by the time it got to the end of the ramp, what would happen is there was enough air coming into the pulse jet engine so it could generate its own power, and there's enough lift over the wings in order to then let it to fly. So actually a remarkable piece of engineering in terms of having to solve each of these problems. And we've got a friend who's traveling with us, and he sort of said, steam, that seems crazy. Think about this, for each ramp there was a steam generating engine that they had to build as well. So this was extraordinarily technically complex, both in terms of the V2 with its jet engine where they're mixing liquid oxygen and, I can never remember what the other thing is, methanol.
Alcohol,
alcohol. Or the V1 where in a sense the rocket was much, much more simple, but actually they had to solve all sorts of other problems. And it starts to talk about also how the Allies found out that these projects were going on.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. One is we've got to remember this was 80 plus years ago, 85 years ago. And so this is cutting edge technology, and it's secret cutting edge technology. And there's a war, not just a physical war going on, but there's an information war where each side is trying to work out what the other side is doing. And the thing that I find really interesting about the production of these super weapons was we know with hindsight exactly how they were used, where they were targeted, and what they were used for. So we know that the V2 was primarily used on civilian populations in the Netherlands and London. But at the time, when these were being developed, the Allies had awareness that super weapons were being developed. Didn't know what they were, didn't know what their capabilities were, didn't know what their targets were. There were, I think, over 2,000 V2 rockets produced. 500 plus were used in anger. Only one was ever fired at a military target, and that was a bridge to stop the Allied advance.
And I bet it didn't hit it.
I think it did. I think it did.
That sounds more like luck than
Yeah.
the technical ability for it to hit it.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure quite how they managed that, because typically it must have been a pretty big bridge, and I don't know the detail, because typically the target for these things was cities, because they, at the time, accurate precision targeting wasn't a technology they had. But from that position of not really knowing what they're for, there's an awful lot of fear from the Allies that these things are going to be used against military targets. And if you think about the build-up to D-Day, we've just had the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the amount of effort that was going into concealing the location of the landing, but also the logistical effort of preparing for the landing. If these massive rockets and the V1s that are obviously slightly smaller but had a similar size warhead were targeted at something like Portsmouth or the staging areas around the south of England rather than London, that may have had a far more significant effect operationally, but of course a very, very different psychological effect.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, because we talk a lot about strategic and operational and tactical. The tactical effect of these weapons was arguably low, and let's
Very
not
low,
diminish the number of people that were killed and the terror it brought, but notionally the strategic importance, and particularly when there's a government that's trying to convince its populace to keep going. The point about the V2 was the fact that you didn't hear it coming.
Yeah.
And in fact, when the first one hit and they realised what it was, because by that time, of course, the government knew about the V2 weapon, there were all sorts of discussions about how they were going to cover it up. So the first couple were gas main accidents. The V1's a little bit different in the sense that, and it's been fascinating talking to my father about this. So he grew up on the south coast in a place called New Romney in Kent, and he talks viscerally about when he was very, very young, and they would go to the fields and work in the fields, and they would hear these doodle bugs come over, and there's this very high-pitched buzzing noise that they call buzz bombs. And he would talk about how the fact that he grew up seeing these things, and how the secret was when you could hear them buzzing, you were fine, because that meant the engine was
still
continuing,
going,
and it was effectively going somewhere else. The trick was, the way these things, as it were, ended, was that a little counter would wind down, and it would say stop now. At that point, the engine would cut out, and then the wing would tip over and it would dive and it would crash. So he talks about how when you could hear it, you were fine. When you stopped hearing it, that was time to take shelter. And he talks about how there were times when he had to jump in a ditch because this thing was coming towards them.
Yeah, and these V1, V2. You've talked about the A1 to 12, and we'll talk about what that means later on. But they were, as the A numbers refer to the program of technological development. The V numbers refer to them when they've been weaponized, and V stands for vengeance, whatever that is in German. Because these were...
I did know about 30 seconds ago before we started, but I've forgotten.
But these are the retribution weapons to cause that psychological damage. They were deliberately designed to target the civilian populations, as I said, of the Netherlands and London particularly. And actually, there was a couple of Luftwaffe operations where they tried to use V2s to target military targets on the south coast of England, and Hitler personally intervened and said, no, I said these are deliberately to target London, they are only to be targeted on London. And the reason that your father-in-law in Kent was probably so affected by these weapons was not just because clearly the overflight to get to London goes over the Kent countryside, but also as part of the countering of these weapons, the double cross operation, which was effectively British intelligence having got control of all of the German human intelligence agents within
Spies in the UK.
within the UK and turn them, meant that we were now able to feed false information back to Germany. And one of the things they were doing was only reporting the successful strikes of the V1 and V2s that were hitting the east side of London. And as you say, they were covering up lots of these strikes with news stories about gas leaks and gas explosions or conventional bombing, and they were hiding the fact that actually the centre of mass of these things was central London. What the Germans did, because of course these are nascent, in development sort of technologies, was took all that information, worked out where the centre of mass was, and adjusted their targeting, adjusted the timing and the trajectories to try and bring it into the centre of London. And what they actually started to do was to pull them much further towards the south coast and over Kent. But that was a deliberate decision made by the British government. And if you think about it, it's very similar to that conversation we had in the Dilemmas episode, where you get to pull a lever to save 6 people but kill 1 person on a train track. Well, in this case, you're making the conscious decision to have these weapons land still in fairly populated areas, but away from central London.
Less populated.
But less populated, and that was a deliberate and very successful operation. What I think is really interesting about both of these systems is some of the ways that British and a combined Allied intelligence effort worked out where they were and what they were.
So we just moved inside. It was getting pretty windy outside, but I think what you were talking about, Gareth, was why it was hard for the Allied forces to understand what was going on here at Peenemunde and find the development work around the missiles.
Yeah, absolutely. So I find this particularly fascinating because, as you know, my background is in intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. So how the Allies worked out what was happening and then used that information to undermine the project was, I think, shows ingenuity and sheer brilliance and determination. But it goes back to before the war. So it started with the research programs, which were academic research into rocketry in the interwar years.
It was actually considered more of a hobby. Rocketry was a thing that you did.
So a slight sidebar, actually, there's a very famous German scientist who was effectively Werner von Braun's number 2, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but his PhD thesis, when he submitted it, was all about rocketry and the fact that you could potentially get rockets out of the atmosphere and into orbit. And it was rejected, not based on the science and the academia, but based on just the notion of doing it. And it was rejected because they said it was too utopian. And he went off and self-published it anyway and decided he didn't need a PhD. So yeah, you're entirely right. But just before the war, so I think about 1936, so 3 years after the Third Reich had been established, lots and lots of German scientists who were involved or had an interest in lots of technologies, but particularly rocketry, were suddenly called back to Berlin, and all of their academic work was suddenly classified. And that piqued the interest of British intelligence, who pulled together a group of people to start the programme of investigation to work out what the Germans were trying to do. And that led to what formally became intelligence operations as the war started. So they already had an inkling of these things. This, as we said, we're in Peenemünde, which is quite close to the Polish border. Lots of Polish prisoners of war and Russian prisoners of war were used to build the site, and information was leaking back to the Polish resistance, which was making its way back to Britain and to British intelligence. Additionally, some very, very brave Polish resistance fighters got jobs here, not as prisoners of war, but actively working as part of the local civilian population, got jobs here to gather information. And that started the interest that led to very, very complex planning for flying aerial reconnaissance missions. And as I said before, the Allies didn't know exactly what the capabilities were, what they were looking at, but they built that up through fusing lots and lots of different pieces of intelligence. But two particular things that I think show the ingenuity of the whole operation are, we talked about the ski ramps from the V1. So those very large ramps that are steam catapults to launch these things. One of the things they did was they looked for where these sites would be along the French and Belgian and Netherlands coastlines, and then lined up the orientation of the ski ramps to effectively do a back bearing onto what are the likely targets.
So we should probably make the point here that the V1 was a very simple device, and so therefore you literally pointed the ramp to where you wanted it to go.
Yeah.
And so therefore, to your point, if you draw the line along the line of the ramp, you can figure out where these things are going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were gyro stabilised, but they were fire and forget. And then the timer was what initiated the detonator and the charge. So, yeah, that's how the Germans did their targeting. But by doing that aerial reconnaissance and then drawing the lines from the ski ramps where they intercepted, those were the target areas. So that allowed the British then to work out where to put their air defence, where to put their radars, and where to put their response fighter squadrons to intercept the V1s. The V2s, and again, this is slightly later in the war, but very, very interesting use of fused technology. Radar technology by 1944 had advanced a huge amount from where it was at the breakout of war in 1939, to the point where they could start to get telemetry data. And what I mean by that is the V2 obviously is a ballistic weapon. It's a rocket that goes up and comes down on a predictable arc. So they put a radar station in Belgium, and the Germans, even after the invasion of Normandy in 1944 and the clearance through Western Europe, were continuing to fire these vengeance weapons at London, which I think says something about the psyche of the Third Reich, that even when faced with the intense firepower of the Allies, and of course the Russians coming from the eastern flank at the same time, and the end days of the Third Reich, they're still producing these weapons and still firing them at London as an act of vengeance. But we put a radar station in Belgium, and when they launched these things out of the Netherlands, out of Holland, to fire at London, we would get a very, very slight arc that was part of the trajectory of these weapons. And they had 11 minutes to get that radar information, also radio back to London, get the rough position of the crash site of that V2 weapon. So they wouldn't have enough time to warn anybody that this was coming, but they could use that impact site and the telemetry data they got from their radars to calculate the rest of the arc, work back and work out the point of origin. And by this point in the war, the V2s were on mobile launch sites. And that 11 minutes gave them enough time to then radio through to a local fighter base, which I think was actually co-located with the radars, to get Spitfires in the air. And there was a squadron of Spitfires in Belgium whose sole job was to go hunting for the launch sites of these V2s. And they would have 11 minutes from firing before they knew that the Germans could collapse down and move off from that launch site.
We keep hearing these echoes. So I remember back in Gulf War I, when Scud missiles, actually ballistic missiles that you can trace direct lineage back to these V2s, that were used by Saddam Hussein to launch attacks on Israel. And what, in a similar way, the actual damage they were doing on Israel was, they were certainly killing people, but it wasn't changing the outcome of the war. But it was such a strategic impact. A significant proportion of the Allies' air power was sent Scud hunting. In fact, Bravo 20 is the story of the SAS section that sort of got lost, as it were, or at least were attacked. This was all about scud hunting. So it's so interesting that these things are rhythms of the past. In the same way, you could argue whether V1 and V2 attacks worth it, in the same way were the scud attacks worth it. But there's a topic that I want to get into, which I think is really fascinating, which is, as we've walked around this area, so right now, as we talk to you, we are standing inside the power station. So they literally built a power station. They needed a power station to generate enough electricity to create the liquid oxygen and presumably other things they needed on site. So it's a huge thing. They literally said, we need to build a power station. And we're standing inside this astounding, huge building. And in fact, just in front of me are some pictures of them building them. The site itself is significantly larger. I mean, we were looking at maps where this is probably one of the largest buildings standing, obviously, because it's a power station. If you can imagine a very large sort of regular sized power station size. But actually, in terms of all the other things they built, we stepped onto a train, and the train talked about the fact that they built a railway system simply to move 20,000 people around the complex where they built these things. So this was a huge effort. And the question I have is how, I'm very glad that it didn't work out. I'm glad that the V1s and V2s didn't actually have a material impact in the end. But as an organisation, if you sort of talked about the German regime as a business, they bet a massive amount of money and effort on this, which in simple terms, you could have built more tanks, you could have built more rifles, you could have built all the things, and yet this was as we talked about, the big, hairy, audacious goal. In the same way we talked about the atomic bomb project.
Yeah.
The atomic bomb project paid off. This project didn't pay off. How do you work out which is the one that's going to pay off and not pay off? And how do you think about it?
Yeah.
The first thing I've got is that I get the sense there's this staggering amount of hubris.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're right, and I think the comparison with the Manhattan Project and the Los Alamos site is really good, because there are definite similarities in scale, in audaciousness of the goal, but there are then some stark contrasts, and I think those are really interesting. So Manhattan Project, free democratic United States, perhaps at a point in history where they are really recognising their growth and power in the world. They're on an optimistic trajectory. Germany under the Third Reich the Third Reich was created out of the ashes of a very, very different economic and social place in history. And they are, at this point, under enormous pressure. They have gone to war in a way that has created all of these problems that it was supposed to solve. It's exacerbated, and Germany is in a really, really tight spot. And socially, this is a dictatorship, and there's an awful lot of paranoia and pessimism. So the Manhattan Project, equally if not more sensitive for the Americans as these wonder weapons were for the Third Reich. The Manhattan Project was based over lots and lots of sites, and there was lots of collaboration. We talked about in that episode about Oppenheimer, about the difficulty of getting the balance right, of having information sharing to be able to collaborate, to be able to innovate, versus security. The Germans didn't have that problem because they just didn't allow any of that collaboration to happen. So they built these huge sites, they built power stations and railways. This is where you lived, this is where you worked, there were hospitals here, you weren't allowed on and off, it was mostly slave labour. And Hermann Goering actually deliberately forbade these different wonder weapon sites from across Germany from talking to each other. Scientists, once they were posted to one place, would only then stay at that one place for the entirety of the war, even though there were other sites working on rocket technologies. They weren't allowed to talk to each other. The other thing, of course, is not only does that stifle your ability to innovate and exploit the new technologies and the new discoveries across different projects and synthesize different things, but it also really impinges on your ability to think strategically, to think about how you're going to use these things collaboratively to meet your objectives. And so decisions about these weapons being vengeance weapons were decisions made by one man who arguably was in a, well, firstly, Hitler was a particularly perverse person in the way that he thought, but secondly, was only exposed to the information that people would feel comfortable exposing him to, so wasn't aware of...
So notionally, no one he didn't sit down and say, right guys, is this still the right investment?
Absolutely.
Is this the thing we should be doing that gets the most strategic outcome? In fact, what he almost certainly did was said, I have decided.
Yeah.
And everyone said, well, we will give you all the information you need to confirm that this is the right thing.
Yeah, and like I said, people would make decisions that would undermine him, and he would then sack them, sometimes even imprison or execute them. And so over time, people become more and more scared to speak the truth, to expose why ideas aren't necessarily the best ideas, to put forward new ideas, or even just to tell people in positions of authority in this authoritarian regime where things are going wrong. So I think, there are two massive problems with the way that this was orchestrated. And I think we've touched on this before as well, is the idea that the Germans had huge efficiency. German efficiency is a kind of cliche. The reality is they were investing a lot of time, effort, capacity and money into developing new technologies without doing all of the other things that enable those technologies to really be brought to bear. So it's actually, as a result, really inefficient. And I think this idea of German efficiency is a bit of a myth, and it's a bit of a cliche. And the reality is that actually they just focused on very particular things. And we in the past have talked about the over-engineering of the King Tiger or other German weapons that as individual pieces of technology were perhaps better, but as the overall technology jigsaw puzzle or mosaic or whatever you want to use as your analogy of the war effort were significantly less efficient.
I also wonder about, this has occurred to me, and there'll be historians or people who know more than us, which is a lot of people shouting at me for this, which is, I almost get the feeling the statement was made, we're going to make these weapons. That is the end of the discussion. Use whatever you have to, go make these weapons. But, this is going to sound terrible and trite. Did they do quarterly planning? Now, what they clearly did was there was lots of some incredibly complex, we need to move this equipment, these people to these locations, we need to build this, we need to that without question, that they went from these small toy rockets in the 20s through to something which was world leading from a technological perspective. But going back to your point, was there a true strategic evolution of their strategy? And I wonder whether the answer is no. And what I mean by that is, it feels like from the later years of the Second World War, from maybe 1942 onwards, they were reacting rather than strategic.
Yeah.
And if they were being strategic, they would say, well, listen, we could make this many more tanks by not having these weapons, as opposed to saying, well, you've told us we have to do them, we're going to go do it, sir.
Yeah, I think the answer is categorically no, this wasn't strategic. And you can see this with, as I said, the fragmentation of these special projects. So the investment in the German atomic project was never enough to get them anywhere close to having an atomic weapon. The investment in the rocketry was enough to clearly get a workable collection of weapons. 22,000
V1s were launched on London. That's an astounding number. 22,000 1,000 of these rockets were made and
Yeah.
launched.
And like I said, 2,000 V2s, of which only 500 and something were ever actually used in anger. But for that 22,000 V1s and that 500 V2s, look at the effort they've gone through, look at the capacity.
Yeah, completely.
And actually, what was the tactical effect of those?
But here's the question for us today, outside of war, thank God. How do you know when you are an organisation or a team investing in a big project? And it could be an organisation investing millions of dollars, or it could be a team investing hours on a project. How do you know? How do you judge whether you're investing in a Manhattan project, kind of a project, or whether you're investing in a V-weapons project, both of which take a huge amount of effort, both of which arguably show progress? 22,000 missiles, you've got progress. One of which achieved a significant strategic outcome and the other one did not.
Yeah.
How do you make those decisions?
So I think, like all these things, strategy is about achieving goals over the long term as the conditions change, under those conditions of uncertainty. So it's that constant reappraisal, reassessment of the value and the risk. And it takes a particularly bold character, a particularly bold mentality to invest in audacious projects that are going to make leaps. But those leaps have to be linked to, if we make this will jump us ahead towards our strategic goals, which we saw with the Manhattan Project. So there was a lot of uncertainty, and it was always a bit of a gamble, but even if it hadn't paid off, all that it would do was slow down. The US and the Allies were thinking about the invasion of mainland Japan. They hadn't stopped planning on that and put all their eggs into the Manhattan basket. With the German superweapons programs, what started as these are the technologies that will mean that we're leaping ahead and we're going to win the war, became more and more, these are the Hail Marys.
These are the things that will save us.
These need to work for us to succeed. Until, by the end of the war, even at, it is absolutely apparent that the end of the Third Reich is coming. Germans are leaving the sinking ship like rats. It is the collapse of the system, and yet Hitler in a bunker can't leave Berlin, is still dictating that they pump money and resources and lives and blood into development of ever more fanciful weapon systems as a desperate attempt to dig himself out of a hole. So for me, I think it's about that constant reappraisal of what is the point, what is it we're trying to achieve, why are we taking these gambles, why are we investing blood and treasure into these projects. Those two comparisons, I think, are quite interesting.
So we're back in Berlin.
We are.
I'm very pleased to say we have in front of us a Berliner Kindle beer.
Berliner
And in
Kindle.
fact, I have a Gurkensalat, which is a cucumber salad, and I know that because I do my Duolingo in front of me, and we've got some Wiener Schnitzel, and what are you having?
Wiener Schnitzel.
We're both having Wiener
Yeah.
Schnitzel, that's quite embarrassing having the same thing. We've had, frankly, an excellent day at Peenemunde. We, obviously, when we spoke to you last, we were actually in the power generating hall, and after that there's another part of museum, or another museum, which is there is U-461, which is a Juliet class submarine. Perhaps there's a different episode talking about why neither of us would like to be on submarines.
Well, yeah, definitely, but that's obviously in the same area, but that's a
Different
Soviet
reason.
submarine,
And
so
then,
a separate
and then
thing.
we sort of went walking.
We did.
And wanted to sort of around Peenemunde. I mean, one of the takeaways for me was it isn't a small area where they did this. It was a massive complex.
Huge.
And so probably about 3 or 4 kilometres where we were speaking, that was where they did the first tests.
Yeah.
And so it's a huge area. But what were your sort of big takeaways?
Well, I mean, picking up on that huge complex thing, for anybody that visits Peenemünde today, you don't necessarily get that sense unless you go walking out with the main museum area, which you're free to do. There are areas that are gated off, but you can wander around the majority of the peninsula. And yeah, large site. As you said, they built a rail line to facilitate moving the prisoners and the guards and all the staff around. I think up to 12,000 people were working there at any one time, so massive complex. Walking around though, we were talking about, and we could tell that the post-war, it was under the occupation of the Soviets and very, very quickly became subsumed into what became East Germany. And it was quite obvious, you've got the feeling that there was more history than the wartime story that we've told so far.
The bit that struck me as we were in the museum, they talk about some of the key players, and we didn't really talk much about those key players, but people like Werner von Braun. So Werner von Braun being the scientist that frankly pioneered rocketry in Germany, and was the scientific lead in all of the V weapons work, and particularly the V2. Interestingly, a member of the SS from 1940, and I'm sure you could argue that he did that because it was a necessary part of the job. I think it was an SS-sponsored project, but you can also argue he knew exactly what was going on. And the reason why I bring this up, not just because there was obviously a number of people involved with SS and things like that, but of course, Werner von Braun, after the war, was very quickly rehabilitated and in fact ultimately became a US citizen because he went on to lead the Apollo program. He was the scientist, in fact. I think you suggested many of the V2 rockets were shipped over to the US, and that was the first sort of scientific baseline for the Apollo program that went on.
Well, certainly, yeah, so probably pre-Apollo program, but certainly the early establishment of NASA and the early US space program. And the V2s were launched from White Sands and were, rather than on ballistic trajectories with warheads, still on ballistic trajectories of course, but were fired up into the upper atmosphere, sort of 80 plus miles up. And some of the first scientific experiments of the upper atmosphere and the different layers were actually conducted using V2 rockets, so replacing warheads with scientific experimentation. But going back to Werner von Braun, but many of the senior scientists, not just in the Peenemünde rocket programs, but senior scientists across the Third Reich and across the German and Nazi regimes' sort of technological programs were, as you say, in sort of air quotes, rehabilitated. And I
was going to say that my question for us to sort of consider was, or maybe not the question, but to look at is the ethics of this.
Yeah.
This was someone who was a member of the SS.
Yeah.
Was responsible for successfully building and completing the V weapons, of which we said 22,000 V1s were launched on the United Kingdom. So there were deaths directly attributable to the work. There were many slave workers that we talked about.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to talk about this from the US perspective. This is also very true of Russia. Were then very quickly taken, and arguably their history was forgotten for the greater good of the country. I don't know how I feel about that.
Awkward.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, the first thing is that if you look back on history, you'd see this chap called Werner von Braun, and no one said the ex-Nazi. So I think it was very quickly forgotten or just not talked about.
I mean, he was a celebrity, in the 1950s America, because the space program became, and certainly 1960s, because the space program became front and center of American excellence. It was the thing that we were in competition with the Soviets with. It was,
So do you do it? So if it was you're the president.
So I think before you ask that question, I just want to make the point that the argument that he was just a rocket scientist and this idea that yes, the Nazi regime were funding rocketry, but it's the rocketry that he was interested in, not the weapons. I don't buy it. So I don't buy it for three reasons. One, that's the collective excuse of everybody. Was, wasn't me, Gav. Everybody else was doing it, but I didn't really know. It wasn't. I was just following orders. Two, a lot of prisoners of war treated very badly, to the point where they built not only a power station to fund Peenemünde, but they built a crematorium to deal with the amount of dead. It is a deliberate industrial scale war crime, of which he was a senior manager of that program. So I think any kind of notion that he just went along with it is bullshit, and I don't buy that.
But so even
thirdly, they were designing weapons that were deliberately and explicitly being designed to target civilians and civilian areas. Now, that there is a wider discussion, because we obviously did the bombing of German cities, and there's a whole discussion about the morality and ethics of war. But fundamentally, I don't think you can just say he was a scientist, he wasn't a military officer. I don't buy that.
But it takes us to an interesting question, which is, would you do it? Would you not do it? And we were apparently fighting for the we were the good guys.
Yeah.
And being the good guys, the reality is the Americans were entering an arms race with the Russians.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this was now there was national prestige, but I think there was also a sense of national security.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think the Operation Paperclip was the US operation to track down and firstly interrogate and then extradite and then use the German human capital that knew all this stuff. So they were stealing. Yeah, they had liberated Western Europe, so they were finding and acquiring military technology. They were finding all the documents, but they were also finding the people who had that tacit knowledge. And as the Germans fell back, they were destroying lots of stuff to hide the capabilities. And as you said, and a lot of it was just being destroyed in the chaotic battle. And then equally, the British were running operations to do the same thing, and so were the Soviets. And we knew that this big contest was coming. It's a complex moral dilemma, because the Soviets treated the German scientists far more harshly. But I think if we were going to do it again, I would hope we would do it differently. So I think there was a justification for the race to get as much technology and advantage as we could. I just think there is moral hazard in absolving people from wrongdoing just because there is another competition, because there will always be another competition, there will always be another national security threat, but if you don't uphold the moral values that you as a nation or as a society
supposedly embody,
then the whole fabric of that society and what it stands for starts to erode. So easy for me to say, very difficult situation, but I would hope we would do the same thing in a different way.
Well, look, anyone who gets a chance to come to Berlin and do the 3.5-hour drive to Peenemünde, I think it's safe to say we heartily recommend that. Fascinating from a history perspective. If you come in the summer when it's a nice day, beautiful place to walk and get around, lots to do. And then, of course, coming back to Berlin, as we see in front of us, our schnitzel and my bratkartoffel. Recommend you do it. So we'll call this one a day. I hope you enjoyed our sort of slightly different episode. We're on the road. If you have, please like and review. If you haven't already, subscribed as well. We would love to hear from you. We're on X at Battling with Biz. We're on Gmail at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. But for now, as Gareth is already digging into his schnitzel and is looking at me like, you're going to make me say goodbye in a second, it's goodbye from us here in Berlin. and we'll speak to you again soon.
Frost.
Oh, very good. Very strong finish with the Frost.